What if I told you that Adolf Hitler's bedtime routine and a pair of grey suede shoes almost changed the outcome of World War II? On June 6, 1944, the fate of the world hung in the balance on the beaches of Normandy. The Allied invasion was underway. German panzer divisions, the most powerful armoured units in Europe, sat ready to crush the landing forces. But there was one problem. Nobody could wake up Hitler, and his top general, Erwin Rommel, wasn't even there. He was shopping for birthday shoes for his wife. This isn't just a bizarre historical footnote. This 9.5-hour delay might have changed the course of the entire war. To understand how ridiculous this situation was, you need to know about Hitler's sleeping habits. Hitler was a night owl. He'd stay up until 3 or 4 a.m. talking to his inner circle. On the night before D-Day, June 5, 1944, he was up until 3 a.m. at the Berghof, his Bavarian Alps residence, watching newsreels with Joseph Goebbels and Eva Braun. He'd ramble about architecture, his vegetarian diet and digestive problems, or whatever crossed his mind. Then he'd sleep until 10 or 11 a.m., sometimes noon. This wasn't just a personal preference. Hitler made it an absolute rule. Nobody, and I mean nobody, was allowed to wake him. Not for emergencies, not for military disasters, not for anything. His generals knew this. His staff knew this. And his staff was terrified of violating this rule. On D-Day, this absurd rule collided with the biggest military operation in human history. And Rommel, Germany's top defensive commander for the Atlantic Wall, wasn't even at the front. He'd gone back to Germany to celebrate his wife Lucy's 50th birthday on June 6th, and to buy her those grey suede shoes. So when the largest invasion in history began, Germany's defenses were led by no one. If you appreciate deep dives into history's biggest what-ifs like this, I'd be grateful if you'd consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps more people discover these stories, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Here's the exact timeline of what happened on June 6, 1944. At 6:30 a.m., Allied forces began landing on the beaches of Normandy. Within hours, over 156,000 troops were storming 5 different beaches. The invasion had begun. German commanders on the ground immediately recognized what was happening. This wasn't a diversion. This was the main invasion. They needed reinforcements. They needed tanks. They needed the panzer divisions. But there was a massive problem. Only Hitler had the authority to deploy the key panzer reserves, the 12th SS and Panzer Lehr divisions. He'd centralized that decision-making power to himself. The generals couldn't just send them. They needed Hitler's direct order, and Hitler was asleep. Around 4 a.m., calls came in to Hitler's headquarters. German commanders requested permission to wake the Führer. The answer came back, absolutely not. His aides were too terrified to disturb him. Let that sink in. The largest amphibious invasion in history was underway, and the man who could authorize the counterattack was taking his beauty sleep. Hitler finally woke up around noon, roughly 5.5 hours after the landings began. And here's the kicker. When he woke up and heard the news, Hitler was excited. He thought Germany would easily defeat the Allies on the beaches. He initially dismissed Normandy as a feint, just a diversion, before the real invasion at Pas-de-Calais. Hitler didn't authorize the release of the panzer reserves until 4 p.m. That's 9.5 hours after the first Allied troops hit the beaches. By then, 156,000 Allied troops had landed. Defensive positions were being established. naval gunfire support was in full effect. The critical window had closed. But here's the question historians are still fighting over. Would it have actually mattered if he'd woken up on time? Now, here's where it gets interesting, and where historians have been arguing for decades. Could Hitler have actually stopped D-Day if he'd been awake? Some historians say yes, absolutely. The argument goes like this. By the time Hitler authorized the panzers at 4 p.m., the Allies had already secured their beachheads. They'd landed 156,000 troops, established defensive positions, and begun moving inland. Naval gunfire from Allied ships offshore provided massive firepower support. But in those first few hours, between 6:30 a.m. and 4 p.m., the Allied forces were at their most vulnerable. Troops were pinned down on the beaches. Equipment was still being unloaded. Defensive positions weren't fully established. The 21st Panzer Division, the only German armored unit that managed to counterattack on D-Day, actually reached the coast and briefly created a gap between British and Canadian forces. They showed what was possible, but they paid a devastating price. 70 tanks destroyed out of 124. Over 56 of their armor wiped out in a single day. If the 12th SS and Panzer Lehr divisions had arrived during that critical window with Hitler's authorization, they could have reinforced this counterattack and potentially pushed directly to the beaches to throw the Allies back into the sea. That's the Hitler's sleep cost Germany the war argument. But other historians disagree completely. And when you look at the numbers, their case is pretty compelling. They point out that even if Hitler had been awake and given the order at 6:30 a.m., it might not have mattered. Here's why. First, Allied air superiority was absolute. On D-Day, the Allies flew 14,674 sorties. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, managed only 319 sorties. That's a 46-1 advantage. The Luftwaffe shot down only 24 Allied aircraft while losing almost everything they sent up. Any panzer division moving toward the beaches in daylight would have been hammered by Allied aircraft. The 21st Panzer's catastrophic tank losses, 70 out of 124, show exactly what happened when German armor tried to move during the day. Second, Allied naval gunfire was devastating. Battleships and destroyers offshore could accurately hit targets miles inland. Moving tanks toward the beaches meant exposing them to some of the heaviest naval bombardment in history. Third, deception. Operation Fortitude had convinced Hitler that Normandy was a feint and the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. Hitler kept major reserves waiting there for 7 weeks after D-Day. Even when awake, he was making decisions based on false intelligence. The Germans even fell for dummy paratroopers. Operation Titanic dropped dummy paratroopers with firecrackers to simulate gunfire. Half of the 12th SS Division was sent to deal with what turned out to be dummies near Lisieux. Some historians argue that by 1944, Germany simply didn't have the resources to stop an invasion force of that size, regardless of Hitler's sleep schedule. The Allies had spent years planning Operation Overlord. They'd built overwhelming numerical superiority in troops, equipment, and supplies. But the real story isn't just about D-Day. It's about what Hitler's sleep schedule reveals about something much darker. But here's what makes this story even more fascinating. Hitler's sleep schedule was just one symptom of a much larger problem with Nazi Germany's command structure. Hitler had deliberately centralized decision-making. In 1938, he created the OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, specifically to concentrate military power in his hands. He didn't trust his generals. He'd personally taken over strategic military planning, often overruling experienced commanders. He insisted on approving major operations himself. This created a system where generals on the ground, the people who actually understood the battlefield situation, couldn't act without permission from someone hundreds of miles away who might be asleep. Compare this to the Allied command structure. Eisenhower had given his commanders clear objectives and the authority to make battlefield decisions. When something unexpected happened, they could adapt immediately. The German system was rigid, top-heavy, and dependent on one man who kept irregular hours and made increasingly erratic decisions. And this pattern repeated throughout the war, with catastrophic consequences. Hitler's Festplätze, or fortress strategy, exemplifies this perfectly. He would designate cities to be held to the last man, turning them into death traps for German soldiers. The first was Ternopil in March 1944, just 3 months before D-Day. Hitler ordered 4,600 German defenders to hold the city against Soviet forces. He refused to allow retreat. Only 55 soldiers survived. That's a 98.8 casualty rate. Think about that number. 4,545 men died because one person refused to authorize a retreat. This pattern repeated throughout 1944 and 1945. Stalingrad, Budapest, Breslau, Königsberg. Cities designated as fortresses became mass graves because one man refused to authorize strategic retreats. By the end of the war, Hitler's centralization had become completely destructive. He issued the Nero Decree in March 1945, ordering the destruction of all German infrastructure, bridges, factories, power plants, everything. His logic: if he lost, Germany deserved to be turned to ash. His own minister, Albert Speer, had to secretly disobey the order to save Germany from its own leader. So, could Hitler's sleep schedule have cost Germany D-Day? The truth is, probably somewhere in the middle of these two arguments. Could earlier deployment of panzers have made the invasion more costly for the Allies? Almost certainly yes. The 21st Panzer Division's brief success reaching the coast and creating a gap between Allied forces shows what was possible. Those first few hours mattered, and having the 12th SS and Panzer Lehr divisions arrive while Allied forces were still establishing their positions would have been catastrophic. Allied casualties were approximately 10,000 on D-Day, with around 4,400 killed. With earlier German armor deployment, those numbers could have been significantly higher, possibly high enough to stall the invasion at the beaches. Could it have actually stopped the invasion entirely? Probably not. The Allies had overwhelming advantages: 14,674 sorties to Germany's 319. Naval supremacy. Intelligence superiority that kept German reserves waiting at Pas-de-Calais for 7 weeks, and 156,000 troops with more coming. Even if the initial landing had been repelled, the Allies would have tried again, better prepared and with even more force. But here's what's undeniable. Hitler's need to control everything, combined with his chaotic personal habits, created a command structure that couldn't respond effectively to rapidly changing situations. On D-Day, this meant German commanders spent critical hours, 9.5 hours to be exact, waiting for permission to act, while Allied forces consolidated their positions. By the time Hitler authorized the panzers at 4 p.m., the moment had passed. Those hours mattered. They might not have changed the ultimate outcome of the war, but they certainly affected how much longer it lasted and how many people died. The story of Hitler sleeping through D-Day is often told as a bizarre anecdote, the dictator who couldn't be bothered to wake up while his general shopped for shoes during the world's largest invasion. But it's actually a perfect example of how authoritarian systems fail in crisis situations. When you concentrate all decision-making power in one person, you create a single point of failure. And when that person refuses to be disturbed during their mandated sleep schedule, while 156,000 enemy troops land on your beaches, you get exactly what Germany got on June 6, 1944. The Allies didn't just have better logistics, air superiority, or more resources. They had a command structure that could actually function when things didn't go according to plan. Hitler's sleep schedule didn't lose him the war, but those 9.5 hours of delay while he slept, combined with a command system that couldn't adapt without him, are a pretty good symbol of why he was always going to lose it.